Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Boms. I'm the Executive Director of F-Data North America, and delighted to be here with you with an incredible panel of open finance experts to talk about lessons learned from abroad on open banking in Canada. We have with us Christine Day from Questrade, Simon Boulet from Wealthica, and Alice Davidson from Mogo. We'll get into more detail about how each of these companies is a practitioner and an expert in the field of expanding financial access and inclusion, bringing about more transparency, better competition for consumers and SMEs. But I think the best place to start before we get into the nitty gritty is a definition of what we mean by open finance. So I wonder, Christine, maybe I'll start with you. If we could just have everybody give their view of what we're talking about when we say open finance. What is it we're trying to accomplish?
Sure. So open finance really speaks to putting the customer at the center, putting the customer in charge when it comes to that ownership of the actual data that they themselves are producing by engaging with financial services and the mechanisms by which that data can be shared and used by the customer with their consent to enable their consumption of different financial services from a variety of providers. And in doing so, and by enabling this, opening up opportunities for new choices to be brought to the market, for innovation in the space, and doing so in a manner that protects the customer throughout this engagement with their data. So all of that together, and all of the underpinnings, be they kind of technical or policy based, that enables all of that in totality is open finance.
Simon, do you agree with that? Is there anything you would add to that
Wow.
definition?
Yeah, no, that was a pretty good definition. I wish I would have gone before Christine. So Christine, I think you hit the nail. It's empowering Canadians. To me, it's perhaps using third-party apps of their choice, knowing that they can use those apps securely. We're talking about open finance, but before that there was, or I like at Wealthica, we're going to talk about Wealthica a little later, but we are an aggregator, so we aggregate everything, and I think open finance allows this. But before aggregating everything, there was an industry that was being de-aggregated, where people start, to have their mortgage at some neobanks, perhaps use a different account for their brokers, and now open finance really opens the door for more competition, better pricing, a more secure access to their data, and empowering the user. It's their data. Let them use their data with third-party providers of their choice.
Alice, I know it's super unfair now to ask you to go after both Christine and Simon, but I promise you'll get the first cut at the next question. But anything to add on the definition?
I was going to say, tough to follow. No, great summaries, guys. I would echo all of that. To me, it really comes down to consumer control and consumer choice. I often use the analogy of, we pick up our cell phone, and with one small tap or one small swipe, we have the ability to share our location, share our photos, share our movement through apps. Yet there's this inability and resistance to sharing the financial data that is a result of our transactions. So to me, it's putting the consumer in total control of that data and enabling them to choose between more providers, more innovative services, everything that Christine and Simon have said.
Fantastic. I've taken recently to using one of our colleagues in Europe's analogy of it's open banking is electricity, right? It's the notion that you've got this plug in your house. You don't really have to understand exactly how it works, but you've got to know that you can plug any appliance you want into it, and there's a 99 to the 5 nines chance that you're not going to get electrocuted when you do, and that you're safe and secure. But I guess that begs the question, and Alice, I promised we'd start with you, so we'll start with you here. So we don't have open finance today in Canada, obviously. And I think the four of us have spent a lot of time talking and working towards trying to get to that outcome. But the very fact that your three companies, in addition to many F-Data member companies, exist is a testament to the fact that even in the absence of open finance, there is the ability to some extent for users in Canada to permission their data to get the benefit of some of these kinds of services. So Alice, maybe starting with you, and then we'll ask everybody to opine. Um, what is Mogo doing today with user permission data as kind of a lens through which to view the potential opportunity of open finance if it was deployed more broadly?
Thanks, Steve. That's a great question. So, number of ways in which we're using permission data. One, I would say, is from a lending perspective, having a cash flow based decision adjudication process. For the most part in Canadian lending, it's always been reliant on Equifax data, credit file data. And as we know, that is not very inclusive. Not all people have a 3-year credit file. Not all people have a well-established credit file. They may have had financial difficulties in the past that then preclude them from sort of moving forward. So for us, we take a look at a number of different factors when making a credit adjudication decision, and having the ability to actually see somebody's cash flows and their day-to-day finances enables us to, offer better rates, better terms on that, and allow them to sort of move from that, whether it's cycle of bad debt or prior poor financial decisions, and enable them to move forward. So that's one way. We recently acquired Moka, another Canadian fintech. It's a save and invest app. Some of you might be familiar with it, but what it does, it uses a roundup feature to round up your daily purchases, and then takes those pennies that have been rounded up and effectively invest them, right? So it's and that solution is made entirely possible through data aggregation today. And I often say, Steve, as you know, the workarounds, right? There are workarounds in the current system, and it is all permission based, and the consumer is very well aware of what is going on, and in fact want to provide that data. So that is another, I think untapped. There's so much potential there, right? The other thing that we've struggled with as a company through the years is, due to the lack of real-time rail in Canada and payments, this whole notion of irrevocable and irreversible instant transfers of funds. And that is still a problem that we continue to try to solve for. But one way of being able to use data aggregation is you've got a risk portfolio on your customer, and they're ranked within a different level of, based on their financial situation, your relationship with them. But the ability to sort of check that, right now a consumer can send you funds, but really has 90 days to reverse it, right? And say, I didn't authorize this. They might have already spent the funds if it's put onto a prepaid card. And then the business is left holding the bag there, right? And could be a victim of fraud. So this enables us to sort of do a check, right? Of, okay, they still have these funds. These funds are going to clear. And again, not ideal, not the solution we're looking for, but it's something that we've used in the past as different solutions come onto the market, again, to overcome these gaps that we have.
Thanks, Alice. Simon, you alluded a little bit to it. Wealthica is aggregating information today, even in the absence of open finance. But maybe you could spend a little bit more time in detail talking about how user permission data is being harnessed at Wealthica today.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So data aggregation is everything at Wealthica. Our entire business is based on data access and data aggregation. So Wealthica is an aggregation platform, an online application, and a mobile app as well, that allows investors and advisors to see all their accounts, their investments, their mortgages, their credit cards in a single platform. We started 6 years ago as an investment aggregation platform. So we started really focused on investments, and we grew out to adding banking and mortgages as well. So we have our own connections into the system. So we act as a pure aggregator, if you want. We extract that data, we refine that data to, on the investment side, that might be transaction recognition, securities identification. So we do all the heavy lifting, and we present the dashboard. So we pull each day account balances, account types, transactions, et cetera, et cetera. We're Canada's largest financial aggregator by number of supported institutions, and also the only one that has really built an expertise on investment data. So every day, Steve, you could connect your investments account, and we have access. We need access on your consent, with your consent, and we use data access to pull your information. You can track your investments. You can receive notifications if new transactions, new dividends. It can help you prepare your tax as well, because to do your capital gains. And I would say we're more on the B2C side. Interestingly, the three of us, Christine Ellis and I, are all from the B2C side. So, but we also have a white label version that we provide to advisors and family offices. So we're B2C and B2B2C.
So, Simon, I'm going to push you because Alice was mentioning the workaround, which is a phrase I've heard her use before. So if you take kind of the other side of this and say that the success that Wealthica has had is in some ways despite the fact that there's not open banking in Canada. Can you talk a little bit to what some of those barriers are for Wealthica? Like, what are you seeing that in the absence of customer-driven finance makes it difficult to provide these types of services to your users?
Oh yeah, great question. Well, for us and for the consumer as well, I think the biggest barrier, if I want to be very precise, is probably the terms of services at the banks. Maybe I'm taking a very macro look, but the terms, we hear this all the time. The credential sharing, a lot of the connections today still works with credential sharings. Some institutions have public APIs, so we use API whenever available. And using credential sharing doesn't necessarily always mean that we're doing it without the knowledge of the institutions. We do have whitelisting discussions and some agreements with some institutions as well. So despite asking for your credentials, which is the only, for most of the institutions in Canada right now, it's the only way for us and for Mogo or anyone else to access the data. So going a bit further, the terms are the big challenge, and I think this is definitely something that's going to be tackled with the open banking regulation. And the banks in their terms don't necessarily make the difference between the recognized aggregators or the recognized players in the industry versus, Uncle Bob or John, who's, you're going to share your credentials and, don't necessarily know what's going to happen with those credentials. So I would like to see more transparency. And talking about transparency, maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself, but interestingly, in the last year or so, we've seen some banks in Canada adding account aggregation to their own platforms. Today, RBC and National Bank allow their clients to add their TD mortgage in their platform. So on one end, they are discouraging credential sharings for a very valid reason. Even myself, I'm always double thinking if I use another platform that's asking for my credentials. Okay, do I trust them? What's going to happen? So we need regulation around that data governance, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this later. But the terms are really the key, at least for the consumer perspective, because I think in terms of privacy, in terms of security, we are already doing a lot. I mean, I think we're doing pretty good. Obviously, we need regulations to make sure that every players are on the same foot. But I would like to see more transparency, particularly knowing that some of the banks are doing aggregation themselves.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Simon. So we're in an interesting time in this conversation in Canada because, as you alluded to, there have been ongoing conversations with the Department of Finance for the last more than 3 years now, going back to February of 2018. And frankly, I think there's been some informal conversations that even predate that. But this is a panel where we'll talk about lessons learned from abroad. And I think it's fair to say that Canada has been one of the slower, perhaps even the slowest mover compared to some of the other large economies on this issue generally. You mentioned, Simon, that there's been movement within the FIs on aggregation. I'd note from a market development perspective, there's also been more, at least from a public-facing perspective, more talk about transitioning from credential sharing to APIs just in the market, even as the government starts to really think about the policies around open finance. So Alice, maybe I'll put this to you, but Simon, please chime in. In your view, is merely the transition to APIs, is that open banking in and of itself?
Absolutely not. It's just another technological means, right, to access that information. It's really no different than where data aggregation is today. We still need an entire governance system to be developed around it. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's going to solve some of the barriers that Simon had mentioned, connectivity issues, selective use by banks, restrictions. But it's definitely, it's a starting point, I would say, and it's a step in the right direction. But, and I know we're going to get into all of these details. There's a multitude of protections that we have to put in place, and a governance system and a accreditation system to make sure, as Simon suggested, we create a level playing field for FIs and fintechs, but also, seed out the bad actors. That's equally important here, as you've alluded to. We are sharing information, and again, we want the consumer to be in control of who they're sharing that information for, but unfortunately, there are bad actors in the space that are going to try to take advantage of that, right? So yeah, no, absolutely a step in the right direction, but just a starting point. And I think what we've seen maybe from abroad is the API solution. It shouldn't be absolute. There's a need to have data aggregation as a backup, right? So the APIs are not bulletproof, they're not foolproof. There's been a limit as to the type of information that is being shared as well, which creates, that's to me is not open finance. That's still sort of selective open finance, if you will, right? So I think there's continued opportunity. To your point, Canada is lagging behind in this. Maybe here's our chance to take the lead and be a little bit more innovative and learn from the mistakes in other jurisdictions, learn from there, because they have been well ahead of us in some regards. And how do we make it better? How do we make the open finance, consumer directed finance system better in Canada?
Simon, what do you think?
Well, Alice has been very polite, saying it's only a technical means, API being only a technical means. Perhaps because of my technical background personally, I'm a former developer, software engineer. So I hate when I hear API. It's a technical word. It means different things for different people. I try to avoid talking about API as much as possible, or just make a comparison to cloud computing. Like, there's so many different definitions of what the cloud is. But again, back to the API, the API doesn't solve any of the governance or the liability questions at all. In fact, it does solve part of the credentials side of things, but at the end of the day, you're still trading credentials with API keys. And if something happens to those keys, you're still exposed. You're still given access to the customer data. So this is just an example, but API doesn't solve everything by themselves at all. And the fact is, again, I hate talking about API, but the fact is, really, API already exists. Banks already have APIs. They use APIs all the time for their own application, their own software. And also, I would like to say that some institutions like Questrade, for example, have been very early recognized the benefit of APIs, and Questrade they've given access to their clients, and they've recognized very early on the benefit of having an ecosystem of apps around their platform. So I think, and one last thing maybe quickly that Alice said about account aggregation, I still think there's room for aggregators, even in an open banking. That's important to understand, because aggregator can bring a lot of value on top of the data, transaction recognition again, or, empowering, AI, vendor identifications. They can do a lot. So the open banking is really about getting access to the data, but I still think there's a market for account aggregators, and this is what we see in other jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, it's a great point, Simon. So again, this is meant to be a lessons learned from abroad. I think that's clearly a lesson that we've learned from Europe, from the UK, from Australia, that there's still a need for account aggregation services to cleanse, to enrich, to categorize data, to build the connections to multiple different types of financial institutions. And I guess if I can just insert kind of moderator privilege, go back to my electricity analogy from before. I think the best way of thinking about the API is it's the wire behind the house, right, in the walls. It's the facilitation of how the electricity gets to your appliance, but it is not in and of itself the solution, because you still need to know that when you plug something in, it's going to work and that you're protected. So I guess that neatly takes us, Christine, to something I was hoping to ask you about. We've talked on and off about the government's role in all of this. And as I said before, the government, through the Department of Finance, has really been looking closely at what was first called open banking, is now customer-driven finance. I know they call it consumer. I think of it as customer because it has to include SMEs. you participated in the latest round of consultations. I wonder if maybe you could just give a sense of where things currently stand in your view in the government's considerations, and then any perspective on how the government through the department is thinking about this through the lens of lessons learned from particularly the UK and Australia, where I know there's been quite a bit of interaction with some of the policymakers there.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, we're really looking for an establishment of what a number of us have been referring to as a North Star, which is some kind of a clear message to all of the stakeholders in the industry of where we think this is heading in Canada. A lot of us know through all of the consultations and discussions the viewpoints of those who will be advising the federal minister, those viewpoints really need to be brought forward and shared, and what is the output of all of the work that's been done the last couple of years, all of the conversations with the stakeholders, all of the discussions and consultations, what has formulated as a set of opinions that collectively show where it is that Canada is going and what we think open banking in Canada should look like. And the reason why that establishment of a true North Star is so important is because in the absence of that, there's a lot of activity going on in a variety of different directions, and those efforts are not cohesive. They are not, moving necessarily in the same direction. And in many respects, there are commercial interests that are starting to kind of manifest themselves in these various working groups, where the original intent of open banking and what it is we're ultimately trying to achieve in the interests of customers is not necessarily at the heart of those, commercial-based work efforts. So, the role of government at this point really has to be a clear direction setting role, a demonstration of leadership and in terms of where this is all going, and then translating that into action. So the creation of an implementation entity, starting to kind of move forward around the definition of expectations for accreditation, and leveraging some of the really good common ground that has been established among all industry stakeholders to move aspects of this forward, while recognizing there are definitely other topics where where stakeholders do not necessarily agree. And someone needs to kind of take the lead there and make some decisions. So that's kind of where we're at, where, I think all of the groundwork has been done. I think all of the conversations have taken place. All of the stakeholders have said, what needs to be said. And now it's time to translate all of that into some action.
So let me put you on the spot then, Christine. We just had a few months ago the budget come out. I know we were hoping that there would be language in the budget on an implementation entity and maybe some funding to really drive this forward. There wasn't. Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Where do you stand on whether government will drive forward on these things in the near-term future?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we would all feel a lot more comfortable had there been some specific language in the budget. There was language in the budget to promote changes necessary to enable payments modernization. So, it was curious to me that there was language around that and not language around this. However, we have been in conversations and we have kind of essentially heard the message like, hey, don't worry, that this government in particular has more flexibility perhaps than normal when it comes to kind of out of budget type of engagements, that there are other tools in the toolbox, and that in general, the situation in Canada, the pandemic being what it is, the government is, more eager than ever to find solutions that will enable the digital economy, that will, propel innovation, propel competition as a mechanism of recovery. So, this may be a bit of a crisis-opportunity, as I like to call it. to find some good in all of the challenges that we've all experienced. But I'm reasonably optimistic. I'm optimistic by nature, but I do think that this government does intend to move forward.
Christine, I love crisis-opportunity. Alice, maybe I'll take Christine's optimistic nature. I'm not optimistic by nature, but I'll go with it. So let's talk about that crisis-opportunity. I think the three of you have been talking about where there's some of the friction still in the Canadian marketplace when it comes to open finance and why there's a need for government to act, and that's a lesson learned from every other jurisdiction that's moved forward. It strikes me that some of those friction points. So, how should consent work? What does liability look like? Authentication, accreditation, made Canada a bit of an outlier during the pandemic with regards to how assistance was provided both to consumers, but also critically to SMEs. I mean, we look just south of the border in the US, the Paycheck Protection Program, where fintechs provided a critical lifeline, particularly to many of the smallest SMEs. So Alice, I guess the general question with any kind of detail you're able to give, what are the opportunities being missed as Canada continues to have these conversations, but there's no meaningful move forward on some of these areas of friction?
So, I mean, in terms of the consumer, I think we're missing out on the choice. What we spoke to in the beginning, consumers are just forced to sort of stay the status quo, stay with their banks. There's not, there's still a sense of distrust, and this isn't regulated. Okay, I'm interested in it, but I'm not sure if my data is safe. I go back to, I think the nomenclature itself is problematic. Open banking, right? And I know we talked about barriers a little bit earlier, but just going back to that, I think there's in Canada, we have a well-established financial banking system, right? That, has carried us through recessions and has been applauded around the world, but it is now has had the effect of, again, stifling innovation and precluding from fintechs entering into the space and providing more. And, there's a lot of, I think, misinformation among consumers of what open banking really means. We live it, we breathe it, we understand it. But I think the average Canadian, if you said that, it sounds like, are you trying to sort of circumvent or append or do something, naughty or inappropriate? And I think, the missed opportunity, again, by not having the government step in and say, okay, we're going to regulate this. We're going to develop a governance system, a liability system. It's going to continue to hold consumers back from adoption. But again, fintechs from effectively being able to compete in the system and without some sort of government oversight and, the czar, as we like to call it, I think about it's an uneven playing field, and it's going to continue to be that. If we've got, liability being negotiated between the banks and the smaller fintechs, I mean, who's going to win here, right? Like it's a no-brainer, right? You've got more negotiating clout the bigger you are, and that's not necessarily the right outcome, right? For the consumer. I mean, I just think about the barriers, even when we're having ideas and we're thinking about product features. One of the barriers often is the fact that there is no consumer direct finance. There is no connectivity. There is none of that. And it shelves ideas, right? And it stifles innovation. And there's so many products that I think don't even come to life because of this. Well, you know what? It's never going to work, or it's going to be too difficult. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too unpredictable. There's going to be connectivity issues, mistrust issues. So I really do. That is the missed opportunity for me. I think it's actually stifling innovation, and that ideas aren't being brought forward because it's the hassle's not worth it, or it's too much work. And to your point, comparing the COVID response and the delivery in the U.S. versus Canada, there was a big win. All of a sudden, we can deposit. Fintechs are being involved, and there's different ways of getting your government funds. Like, wow, we should be excited about that. Like that should have been, that should be just the basics of there's different methods of receiving funds, right? But that was, touted as a win of. Government and FIs are working with the fintech industry. I mean, it's almost laughable, right? That is considered a win versus just everyday reality of that there's that many different funding mechanisms that are available to consumers. Maybe
And
I'll pause
surprise,
there.
surprise, surprise, the financial services marketplace in the US didn't collapse because there was more fintech facilitation of stimulus and assistance to consumers and to
Shocking.
SMEs. I know. Simon, I wonder, you've obviously you spend a lot of your time at Wealthica building connections to various, what we think of as data sources, but financial institutions. Christine referenced before kind of disparate efforts going on within the marketplace at trying to build out APIs or build out connectivity. As somebody who's every day trying to manage that, what has that felt like to you from just an operational perspective? Has it made things easier, harder? What are the impacts?
Well, accessing the data is just, it's right now, it's dependent of the institutions. I can tell a small anecdote, but I did receive a phone call from like a large bank, actually one of the larger banks in Canada over the weekend. Their CTO and their security they were wondering, okay, we're having thousands of requests. It's coming from some IP addresses, and they trace it back to Wealthica. So the game is naturally getting more difficult to get the data, I think. And where I want to go is, again, perhaps because of my technical background, but in computer security, the first thing that you're going to learn is to identify the threat and work to mitigate those threats. And so in terms of data connectivity, I feel a lot of the institutions, perhaps, I'm sure it's in other jurisdictions as well, although they are much more further in the open banking. But for us in Canada, we're still playing the cat and mouse game in several cases. So it's become more difficult. It's frustrating for us, but for the customer as well. At the end of the day, now some institutions they're causing trouble. We're having problems with the refreshes, for example, because it's important for us to get your daily balances and get your holdings. So now we've turned it. We're saying to the customer, okay, listen, this bank or this platform, no, they're just doing everything they can to block Wealthica. Maybe you should move somewhere else. So we've started having that discussion. People, they want access to their data. And it's particularly difficult for smaller players like Wealthica compared to, for example, a Mint or QuickBook, which are huge. So I suppose I know for a fact that they have much easier access to data. I know they are bilateral agreements that not everyone is getting access to. So back to what Alice was saying earlier about innovation and making sure we have, a strong fintech ecosystem in Canada and a strong businesses and innovation. I think having access to your data is key. And I don't want to derail the discussion too much, but it's much more than banking. And something that concerns me a lot is the desire for some institution with the government to try to put the government around the identity, the fact that the bank should be central in identifying you as a person. I just did my tax a little bit late, not too late, but late last weekend, and logged into the CRA website, and I still see the secure key, the connection to your bank, and then that gives you access to, I don't know what's going to happen down the road if, I don't know, I'm getting far fetched out of the payment and but medical data, for example. Now, am I going to log in with my bank to identify me and then getting access to my medical record? So again, getting off the question, apologize, but this is an important subject, and it's something that I thought we have closed the discussion. I thought we were moving forward, and it sounds like in the last couple of weeks, this subject has came back. So I'm wondering. We made some progress. So again, I'm not trying to be optimistic. I'm worried about the timeline, but I've saw like a U-turn here. It seems like we're back to some discussions that we've had before. So apologize. I'm not sure I've answered your question, Steve, but I think that's important as well.
And Simon, I could take this even further askew, because when you said derailed, I've got an open banking as a train track analogy that I could use as well, but I will spare everybody that one too. But I guess, so, Simon, you touched on kind of let's call it pushback, just to be polite, right? The concerns that are raised traditionally by incumbents on this. I would venture to say that you would all agree with me when I say that there's no pushback that's been particularly unique in Canada, that we haven't seen similar types of pushback in other marketplaces. It's on financial stability, consumer protection, um, data security, all the things that we've all heard a number of times before. There's one element that's come up, and Christina and Alice, you both referenced it, and I'd like to go back to it, and that's the customer education piece. This idea that we can't do this because consumers and SMEs don't understand it. And I'd be really curious, kind of as a philosophical matter, for all of your thoughts on, is that, in your view, a real valid reason for not moving forward? And I guess the question is, based on what we've seen in other markets, in your view, what does the end user really have to understand about open banking, which is not itself a product, right? It's the rails upon which a product is delivered, in order for it to be successful? Christine, maybe I'll start with you, because I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah, sure. I do agree with you. It comes up, a lot as some kind of a hurdle that needs to be overcome. And yet, as with most technological innovations that happen, and the policy that kind of enables the broad usage of those innovations, you don't actually need to know how it works, right? You need to know what it enables. You need to know the value proposition. You need to know, what your path of recourse is. So if something goes wrong, who do you contact? How do you get, made whole? How do you know, and give your consent for the usage of data in a way that is easy for you to understand, and easy for you to kind of revoke that access and consent. So you need to know how to engage. You don't need to know anything else. And I think that really the area where there should be more focus on consumer education, in my view, is around, what are all of the things that are preventing you today from what people enjoy elsewhere in the world, right? I mean, 2/3 of the globe are active in an open banking, conversation to varying degrees of implementation. People come, they move to this country, and they think we're absolutely backward when it comes to how we engage and consume financial services compared to what it is they're used to and seeing, and experienced in other jurisdictions. So, if you've lived your life fully in Canada, you have no idea what it is you're even missing. And because there is an element of government action, an element of government legislation even, that is required to properly and holistically move this forward, that does require political will, right? And this is not a voter topic. Like, people don't think about this the way they do about, getting jobs and, other kind of top voter issues. And yet, it's these underlying, limitations in how it is that Canadians can engage in the digital economy that, hold us back as a nation, right? And yet those are the things that are not well understood, and those are the things that are not talked about. So yeah, I would definitely put more effort in helping Canadians understand the gravity of status quo than the underpinnings of how an open banking regime would actually work.
Alice, I saw you nodding. I assume that means you agree with Christine?
I mean, so well put, Christine. Very few things left to add, but I think you hit it dead on. And to me, it's such a cop-out to say, well, people don't understand it, so, let's just not do it. No, you make them understand it. And to your point, they don't need to understand the mechanics. They need to understand the value prop and the protection that they have in case things go wrong, right? It's two very basic concepts. And if I look at, consumer education and consumer literacy, I'll draw from, other aspects of products that we do in the lending. This notion that putting up posters is what's going to educate the consumer about the choices they're making by taking out a loan. versus actually educating them about, okay, this is the reason why you're in this financial situation. How do you improve your credit? How do you move past this, right? There's so much opportunity there, and there's so much missed opportunity by government. And the government levies fees on industry for having these financial literacy funds or educational funds. And the content that comes out of them is just, it's such a waste, right? There's such talk about missed opportunity. Here's another opportunity. And I think Christine hit it dead on. What are we missing out on, right? And showing that campaign of this is the sort of products and services that 2/3 of the globe has access to. And yes, our banking system is great. No problem. It hasn't failed us, but there's more opportunity there, right? There's other options. There's greater choices. And think about the underbanked, right? That we talk about this great ecosystem that we have, a great banking system. It leaves a lot of people behind, right? And with no means to ever move forward and ever become part of the sort of the everyday, the banked for that matter. So, I mean, I could talk about this topic forever, and it drives me insane. And just, again, to suggest that because people don't understand it, it's not worthwhile, or it's absolutely, I mean, it's very, very disheartening to hear something like that, right? And taking a step back, why don't they understand it? That lack of transparency, that lack of, and we're not talking about rocket science here. Simon, you can get into the technical aspect of how it works, but again, the average consumer does not need to know that. They just need to know, what am I doing? What is this going to enable me to do? And how am I going to be protected if things go wrong?
Simon, any thoughts to add on that?
Well, well said, Alice. So that makes me think back a little bit about the benefits for the consumer, and that brought me back to the COVID. One thing that I find interesting, it sounds like it's never the right time for Canadians to, again, back to the previous question, but to move forward, faster with open banking. There was an election a couple of years ago. Sounds like we're getting back maybe soon. There was COVID. There's all those reasons to be laggard on open banking. Not just open banking, by the way, also on the PIPDA with the Bill 11, the new PIPDA regulation. So there's a lot of work going on there as well. But where I wanted to go is COVID. We hear this all the time on the news that there's more and more people being in maybe financial difficulties because of COVID. With house price going up, and the kind of tools that we can provide with open banking can help educate those customers, those Canadians, and help them get out of financial debt, or help them understand their situation a little bit easier. Again, especially in a de-aggregation space where you have your mortgage somewhere, you have your maybe your credit card somewhere else. So there's a lot of missed opportunities right now in Canada. And as Christine said, I mean, it sounds like we're years behind, and it's a bit of a shame. So yeah, that was my thought about what was just said with.
And maybe if I can add to that, Simon, I think not only is there obviously people are facing increasing. I think there's a dichotomy. Some people are facing increasing financial constraints. Others have done quite well. But what also has happened is there's been massive digital adoption by Canadian consumers, right? Being forced to be at home the vast majority of our time has turned, whether it's just, e-commerce, online retail, but also the point is it should be banking, it should be finance. And we've seen an increase in obviously in members, but again, we're limited in what we're able to provide. And going back to, if there's connectivity issues, consumers get frustrated. They're going to say, "Oh, I tried this, it doesn't work," right? And then there's churn. And again, we're stifling innovation. We're also losing consumers because we don't have that sort of consistent, guaranteed connection. And it's just frustrating all around, right? Because people will think, like, "Oh, well, I tried it doesn't really work. I'm just going to stick with what I have, my limited options of what I have." And that is, that is the one industry with this increasing digital adoption that is still so far behind other industries out there, right?
That is a great segue, Alice. It's an unfortunate situation, but it's a great segue. So in our last 10 minutes or so, I'm hoping we can cover both. We're at a crossroad, basically, right? And on the one hand, Christine was very, I think, polite in her description of, there are disparate efforts in place right now being driven by the market, and that's not particularly useful because they're not consistent or parallel. But we've also been kind of talking about government's engagement, even though there's not anything concrete to show for it just yet. So I'm hoping that we can conclude over the next 10 minutes on both kind of the current trajectory and also the trajectory that we are hoping, based on lessons learned from abroad, we see over the next several months. So maybe on the more kind of frustrating side that Christine alluded to before, there are any number of efforts now in place in the market on either digital ID, on CDF and open banking, on API deployment, all of which very well may be well-intentioned. But from all the conversations I think that we've all had with other market participants, is really only serving to make this a much more complicated, unlevel playing field at the end of the day for consumers. And it strikes me, again, this is supposed to be lessons learned from abroad, that Canada is at the moment one of, if not the only country that's trying to move forward on open banking with no leadership by government. It's really kind of just opened the door to industry and said, solve it for the moment. I'm hoping we can get into a little bit more detail around some of the difficulties that that's creating, both from an operational perspective, but for consumers. And Christine, you opened the door to this, so maybe I'll ask you to start opining on it and we can get into a conversation about it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the real challenge with this is there's anti-competitive behavior that kind of manifests itself in all of these different industry groups. And, and it shows up in payments modernization. It shows up in, digital identity attempts, as Simon was referring to with, with the secure key product. It shows up certainly in all across the board in these various open banking solutions and working groups. And part of the challenge for the smaller entities that are really kind of trying to innovate in the space and bring new offerings to customers is that, you can't engage on all of these fronts. It's unclear, where to spend your time in a meaningful way. And, it can become a full-time job for a number of people to try to participate and even have a voice in a lot of these conversations, as compared to, the very large banks who have entire teams, dedicated to lobbying efforts, dedicated to propelling these industry solutions. And that in and of itself, the longer it goes on, it's essentially trying to deliver the message like, hey, government, we don't actually need you because we've already solved for it. We've got an industry solution. Look at all how great it is. And it's only organizations like FData that allow, all of the smaller entities' voices to kind of come together and be magnified in a way that is heard. And so, these are some of the things that, that manifest, and, it breeds frustration. I think that there's actually been a tremendous amount of resiliency shown by Canadian fintech community to keep engaging and to keep propelling the conversation and to keep, pushing and advocating for the right outcomes and consumer centricity. Because I'm sure for a lot of people, engaged in this, and I can say for myself as well, it does get frustrating, right? To kind of, to keep fighting the good fight and not feeling like it's really translating into action. So, or at least the right kind of action. That said, I do remain optimistic. I think we need to recognize that Canadians by nature like to have common ground on things. There was one of, a very early session on open banking, one of the early consultations, where the facilitators were saying, what can we all agree on, and how can we all, come to a shared consensus on how to do things. And my response was, why do we need to agree? Because in every jurisdiction where there is an oligopoly-based market dynamic like we have in Canada, it has required a strong voice from government to propel change. And I don't know why we think it would be any different in Canada.
That is a fantastic place for us to do a round robin closing round, which is based on everything that we've seen from other jurisdictions, based on all the conversations that you all are having. Maybe a kind of 30-second overview. And Alice, I'm going to start with you. What are you hoping to see over the next, say, 6, 12, 18 months to meaningfully drive open finance forward in Canada in a way that provides for the most potential impact for consumers and for SMEs?
Huh. It's a big question.
I know.
Honestly, I think the government needs to play a role. We've said this over and over again. We need, whether it's a department, whether it's a person, someone's got to step up and say, okay, I am going to help industry navigate this, right? I'm going to help you set up the framework. And then I think we need a formal industry group that is made up of incumbents, that is made up of fintechs, that is made up of, associations like FData, consumer protection, that actually works on this together. Because, as Christine said, leaving it to the industry, we're actually just leaving it to the incumbents. There's so much control. We're fighting to have a seat at the table. We need to have a seat at the table, right? And I think that's where we need to move on. That's what I'm hopeful for, that we can actually come together. There's a need for this. There's a demand for this. Let's finally do it. Let's stop talking about, how are we going to do it? Why are we going to do it? Let's just act. We got to finally take action and move forward and do it together, right? And it has to be done in a collaborative manner. I think, as Christine said, it's Canadian. We don't all have to agree on everything, but I think the basics are there. There's been a lot of work done over this, a lot of discussions over the years, a lot of lessons learned again from other jurisdictions. The time is now to actually act and move forward.
Simon, as somebody who deals with the implications of this inaction every single day, what are your thoughts? How do we move forward from here?
Well, I would say quickly, being the laggard or also come with some benefits. The benefits of building on on others' success and trying to avoid their failures. And for example, we know that Canada is leaning toward more of a read-only access as the first step, at least that's my understanding. And I think that's the safest approach. So I still have hope that I think we can move forward quickly. I think we can, not too late, we can catch up. Again, there's a lot of work that have been done on the privacy and consumer protection front in parallel of the open banking. I think that's great. Now we need to focus and we need to move forward. Perhaps look at what the fintechs and the smaller players are doing in terms of constant improvement and moving forward. I think an agile approach. I would like to see more of this well-defined roadmap with clear objective. Maybe we need to hire someone with some very good project management skills at the head of open banking. But I feel this is where we're lacking a pace. Move forward. So now it's time to move forward.
Incremental progress. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Okay. Christine, I know you alluded to some of your thoughts, but wave your magic wand.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is, make the recommendations published. So we know that the advisory group is going to be bringing forward the recommendations, which is the outcome of, all of these consultations over the last couple of years. So making that public sends a really clear directional signal to the market, right, of where this is likely going to be going. The advisory committee needs to continue with the work that they're doing. So their mandate, which as of now has largely concluded, needs to be extended so that they can keep working on this. The implementation entity needs to be set up as soon as possible with full-time dedicated leadership that has the mandate to implement CDF in Canada. And we need to, as some of my colleagues have alluded here, set up that stakeholder group, but do so in a more formalized way. People that are committed to investing the time, that are committed to working through the thorny issues. And there are a number of things that we can move forward on. That includes, voluntary code of conduct for various elements, formulating the accreditation certification framework, and aspects of what that includes, helping to, inform, data scope, which the implementation entity can kind of have a final opinion on. provide clarity for these various working groups so that, they can continue to work, but work so in a manner that aligns with where this is all going. So I think there's lots that can be done, meaningful, difficult work through the right combination of passionate stakeholders and government action.
Well, on that very uplifting and expert note, I'd like to thank Alice, Simon, and Christine. Thank you all for your time
Thank you.
and for your expertise. Thanks everybody for listening, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Everyone.